just takes a minute. There we go. Great. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
fabulous. Well, welcome everyone to another Inspiration Behind the Stories. I'm here with Andrea Dejean, and she is the author of Terra Firma, another one of our fantabulous novels. So if it's okay, Andrea, I'd love to just jump right into it.
All right.
What was the moment that made you say, oh my gosh, I have got to write this?
Well, I don't know if I had a moment when I thought I had to write it, but I had a moment when I could write it because I had the time. I had the kind of financial stability, and I had the emotional distance on what had sparked the idea in the beginning. And I think I just needed some time to kind of digest all of that and grow into it before I could really sit down and say, okay, I think I'm ready to do this now.
Got it. I mean, well, honestly, that's a great intro into the next question. What was the first thing that really sparked the story for you?
Well, Terra Firma actually is the first novel, and I think like a lot of first novels, it is personal. And part of what I wanted to capture in the story was a very emotional, painful, physical memory of the moment when I realized how little I knew about the world and how little I knew about everything, basically. And I was, grew up in a pretty middle-class family in the Midwest. I think we had some issues, but I don't think my family was much different from a lot of families. And went off to university and started kind of coming into contact with people who had grown up differently. And I realized that I just wasn't equipped really to understand what was going on. People were talking about events and places and historical figures and characters, and I didn't know what they were talking about half the time. And it was very emotional. I remember it's like somebody dropped a bomb on my head. And I thought, how could I be 18 years old off at university and be so stupid about so many things? It was horrible. It was a horrible feeling. And I remember thinking, I need to deal with this. This may be personal, but maybe other people have felt this way. And maybe, this would speak to other people, that they had this moment where the outside world kind of came crushing in. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, it totally does.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a lovely transition to another question. Just taking 100 steps back, what is Terra Firma about? What's the actual story about?
I think it's a coming of age story about a young man who's very secure in a familial setting in his life. When kind of outside forces come in and topple things. And he doesn't expect, he's not prepared for it. He doesn't know how to deal with it. Other things happen, and he spends a lot of time trying to figure out who he is, where he's supposed to go, how he's supposed to be. Doesn't really have anyone to ask. And he's a bit lost. And the story is about how he goes about trying to find, his way back to himself, if you will.
Oh, wow. Now, why this story now? Why do you feel as though it's important now?
Well, actually, to be perfectly honest, I wrote this story a long time ago. I would like to think that that has a certain intemporality, that there's certain things about this kind of longing and this kind of searching for the self that is still applicable today, and maybe even more applicable today. I mean, I don't want to, you don't see my picture, but I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And, the world that we live in today is very different. We don't have children. Not around a lot of young people. I don't know how they see the world around them. It's obviously encroaches a lot more than when I was growing up. And, our major information was nightly news, which my father usually fell asleep in front of, lying on the floor in the living room, and which had no meaning for me whatsoever, because, my concerns were or quite further away. So I hope that despite the setting, despite maybe some generational issues, that it still speaks to people about, who am I? Where do I belong? How do I deal with losing people I love? How do I deal with people who are different, etc. So,
understood.
mm.
Were there, I mean, most authors, when they are writing stories, either they come into it with like questions that they're completely obsessed with, or as the story evolves, they find that there are certain questions that they feel as though they need to answer. What were those questions for you?
I don't know that I had certain questions like that. My concern when I write has always been to be honest and to try and deal with an emotion in the most honest way possible. I'm kind of an intuitive person. I'm not a particularly intellectual person. I'm a lot like the main character in the story. I really don't want to say anything stupid either. I want the book to be honest. I want things to feel authentic. I want people to say, wow, I felt that, or I know my son's going through this, or whatever. So I don't know that I had any questions about that, that kind of obsessed me. What obsessed me was being authentic, was being honest, was trying to touch an emotion in people, which is mostly why I write anyway. So
Got it.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. It totally does. Now, within the story itself, what's at stake in the narrative if things just totally go wrong?
Well, I think this is an interesting question, because I think part of what's interesting about fiction is that things do go wrong, and they kind of, in many cases, are supposed to go wrong. It's kind of my job to maybe make them go wrong and then right the ship if possible. And things almost go wrong. I mean, I think in the story, if things had continued as they were going, was headed for disaster in a lot of ways, physical disaster, emotional disaster. But that's part of the control an author has to bring things to a certain conclusion that I hope don't seem too far-fetched.
Understood. And actually, along the lines of that as well, every narrative, it takes you on a journey, right? It takes you on an emotional ride. What kind of emotional ride can a reader expect as they explore this incredible story?
Well, I don't know, and this I think will come up later. Not quite sure who will be moved by this story. I hope young people will be. It's possible that will be more people of my generation, and maybe a little bit younger than I am, where it strikes a nerve where they remember going through that as they were coming of age, as they were trying to find a place for themselves. It's all very confusing, really. I don't think it's talked about enough, maybe, but I hope that kind of emotion is with it. I had a friend who read it and wrote to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many things in the story that I can relate to. And I thought, hallelujah, this is why I write. This is, if I don't get any other feedback on it, that was worth it. I went through this. I had the same interests. Oh my gosh, you just wrote the story of my life. And so that would be very satisfying to me if that kind of emotion that people had gone through and have come to terms with is something that they feel when reading the book. I don't want them to be depressed. I think there's some things in it that are possibly relatively funny, or at least lighthearted. I don't mean it to be a kind of a downer trip, although a lot of serious things happen. So,
understood. Within the narrative, what did you find to be the hardest thing to write, and why?
Well, again, I'm like the main character. I don't want to say anything stupid. And so there's a lot of stuff in there about cartography. There are things about plate tectonics. I was very lucky and I'm very grateful to Dr. Marc Monnier,
Mm-hmm.
who read parts of the cartography to tell me if in fact I had made a mistake. So I was very nervous. I don't know if they were the hardest parts to write, but I think when you're trying to build a story around elements like that, you don't want it to be too heavy. You don't want it to be a textbook. It was very hard to figure out how to provide information that would kind of move the story along without it becoming too dry and too textbook like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I think the parts maybe dealing with, well, the plate tectonics especially. I mean, I have the book that deals with that, and I didn't understand any more than the main character did, but enough to be able to use it in the book. So.
No, I mean, I know you mentioned that you already started writing this like quite a while ago. Where were you as you were writing the story, as it took shape, let's say? And do you feel as though that writing it changed you in any way? And if so, how?
Do you mean physically? Where was I emotionally?
It's
Physically?
typically, we typically mean emotionally. So, like, what kind of an evolution may have you been going through as you were
Well,
doing? But if you want to tell me physically, you can do that too.
well, in fact, I was, well, maybe related, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
because when I left university, I went into the Peace Corps. And I was in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I met the man who eventually became my husband.
Mm-hmm.
And then years later, I went back to join him, and we were in Cameroon, in Yaoundé. And so I was physically there in a situation where I was not having to work and run up to school and worry, if I was going to make my rent and take care of those kind of daily things. So I had kind of the freedom to write and just to sit down and write. And it had been a long time since I had had that experience of going off to university.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd been able to digest it, and I was in a foreign environment, constantly speaking a foreign language, again coming across things that were not familiar, and dealing with this outside world thing with people talking about things I wasn't sure what they were talking about much of the time. And so I think in the process of writing it, I worked through some of the pain that I felt when I first experienced this emotion and kind of worked through it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't mean to keep on making references to the book, but in the book, at one point, the main character says, by naming things, we make them real.
Mm-hmm.
And by writing things, for me, I come to a certain understanding. I kind of grew up on my own. Kind of a complicated story, but was often left to my own devices, and often write to try and figure out why certain things strike me, why there's like a clang that goes off in my head with certain situations, or why certain things just, I need to write through it. That's how I figure out kind of what's going on. And so I think that maybe writing the book changed me in that way, because I worked through those emotions. And it's also just a slog, as you know, and as other writers know. And especially, I mentioned this, I think, in the acknowledgments. I wrote the first draft by hand because we only had this one old clunky computer, and half the time we didn't have electricity. So you certainly didn't want to write something that, then you saw the light bulb starting to go orange, and you thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose everything. So I actually wrote it by hand, so it was really a slog. So I guess I became changed by telling myself that I had set out to do this, and I did it. And then, of course, I had to go back into it and rework it. But anyway, I don't know if I answered your question. I'm going on and on. But
Oh, no. I mean, the purpose of this is to discover, what inspired you, what brought you to author the story. So yeah, you're welcome to continue if you want.
No, that's fine. I think I kind of covered it. But then going back into it later, and I think the more distance I got on the original kind of spark, the easier it was to write it. Although I was very sure from the beginning that the main character needed to be a young man. He's grown up in a rural area. I know nothing about farming. I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in the suburbs of industrial cities.
Mhm.
But all of that, I think, maybe allowed me to, again, put a certain distance on what was a very painful discovery for me at that time. And maybe it is for everyone. I really don't know.
Mm, mm.
Mm,
Understood.
so, mm.
Was there anything that you found surprising as you were actually writing the story? And I
Well,
know you mentioned the young man being the primary character, but yeah.
well, actually, strangely enough, I kind of saw the setting in my mind, which is a
Mm,
totally fictional place.
mhm,
But it was very clear, the getting them through the houses, out into the yard, out, down the road. Um, it's not like I've never been out in the country, but I didn't grow up in that environment, so I was a little bit surprised that it was very clear to me what the family setting was, and since that was relatively important, especially at the beginning of the book.
mhm.
Um, I was a little bit surprised that came so easily, in fact.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mm. But I did
Um,
do my homework a little bit on farming,
well,
so I
that's
wouldn't say
good.
anything, I wouldn't say anything stupid again.
Was there anything that and any character within the story that you found really challenging to write?
The the character I found the most difficult to write about was his aunt.
Mm,
Um, I'm very old school, as you probably noticed, and I very much adhere to the adage that in good fiction there are no villains,
mm,
and because you have to, even if you don't respect someone or you don't like them or they do things you don't like,
mhm,
um, if you understand their motivation behind it, then I think it makes the story richer and provides a certain texture that makes things a little bit more difficult, like life. And I didn't want her to be a villain, um, and that was very hard to try and find a way to, I hope, humanize her, especially at the end,
mm,
because we're seeing it through the young man's eyes, and he feels very much like she's got it in for him, kind of thing, and that she has a lot of resentment towards him. So it was hard to try and make her into a more humane character, and someone who's had her own struggles, and someone who eventually evolves and moves on, like we do in life. So
got it.
I would say, yeah. Mm.
Um, is there anything that almost didn't make it into the story, and why did you keep it?
Yeah, that's a good question, but honestly, I don't think so. I did the silly thing of not planning the story out at all,
Mm,
and so I just kind of followed through on a whim, and then of course that ends up being the work of when you go back into it, which is obviously much harder, and trying to clean things up and edit things out, etc. But I don't remember that there was anything that responds to that,
mm. Was there
So
anything that you did keep out that, in retrospect, you wished you'd kept?
no, no, I don't think so. It was really pretty much, like I said, I was free flowing kind of. It was a first attempt, and I just thought, just get it down on paper, and deal with it later. Little did I realize how how difficult that is. And now that I've written, two novels, and I realize that going back and trying to clean things up that you didn't properly write in the first place is more
Mm,
difficult than just. But I didn't want to kind of impede anything. I just wanted to let it go and just flow out, and so I just let it happen that way.
got it.
Yeah.
Um, Now, I know you already mentioned that you had a dear friend who reached out to you to tell you, "Oh my gosh, I completely connected with this." What kind of person, or is there a personality type, or yeah, a type of person that you feel really kind of falls hardest for the book?
That's a good question. I don't really know. Maybe I don't even really know how to answer the question. I think that what's important for me as a writer is that people have a certain amount of empathy for the main character, or they have a certain amount of, they identify with certain things. So I guess someone who's open to those kinds of emotional issues, and even if they are relatively far removed from their own experience, but that the emotional, there's something very basic and vital about some of the longing and some of the things going on that people can say, I can deal with this. This was very important to me when I was growing up. I don't know about you, but reading and finding characters and saying, wow, I felt that way, and I feel a little bit less alone, a little more normal, and not like such a weirdo out there. But so it's a good question, and I'm not sure I've answered it, but I guess someone who can identify with this, what I think is a relatively painful period of one's life, trying to find your footing, and especially if you have to do it on your own.
Now, was there anything within the story that people tend to come to you and say, oh my gosh, I was not expecting that?
I haven't had a lot of feedback. And to be honest, I hope that they don't. Because I hope that I've constructed the story in such a way that there are not too many surprises. In other words, there are little hints along the way, little crumbs that you leave. And that, in fact, on the contrary, that when something happens, people will be like, I knew that was going to happen. And it's a little bit of a release point where I was like, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that was going to happen. So didn't intend in the writing of it to have anything particularly surprising, I don't think.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Now let's say someone decides they're going to explore this and they get into the first, say, 20 pages or so. What makes them continue forward?
Well, I hope there's a little bit of a mystery going on with one of the characters who goes missing, and trying to figure out what happens there. But again, I very much someone who's concerned as a person, as a writer, with feeling empathetic towards other people, with identifying towards other people, and that maybe there's something in the main character's situation, in the way he expresses himself, and in the emotions that he's feeling, and that they'll say, oh, wow, I like this guy, or he reminds me of somebody, or myself, and I wonder what's going to happen, and is she going to make it, So I recently, if you don't mind, I can tell an anecdote. I recently read a novel that I picked up by chance in a used bookstore, and from the get-go, I didn't really care too much about the main character. And I had a hard time going through it. I don't know, there was something about the main character, and I thought I couldn't feel empathetic. And I had a really hard time going through it. So I think, I keep on coming back to this word, but I think it's pretty important to me as a person and as a writer to have people care about it, and that it feels authentic and honest. So.
Got it. In one sentence, could you describe why someone should pick up this book?
Because it's a good little story. I think, I hope. I'm old-fashioned enough to be someone who still feels like stories have to have a beginning, middle, and end, and they have to kind of deal with things that we live on a day-to-day basis, even though there are a lot of outside things happening that are relatively dramatic that we all go through. But it's kind of this dailiness of life, and it's just a little story that doesn't end too badly, and going along on this like ride with him as he grows into himself.
Well, Andrea, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting.
Yes, thank you.
For anyone who's watching, so you know, at least until the end of March, Terra Firma is available in ebook form for 99 cents. So please take this opportunity to go and check out a completely new story. And with that, again, I just want to thank you, Andrea, and wish you a fantastic.
Thank you.